Hello, and thank you for tuning into Answers from the Lab, where we share Mayo Clinic knowledge and advancements on the state of testing and science from laboratory leaders and the people who are making it happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Bobbi Pritt, the chair of the Division of Clinical Microbiology in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. With me today is Dr. Bill Morice, the chair of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic and the president of Mayo Clinic Laboratories. This is our weekly discussion with Dr. Morice, in which we learn about updates in the field of laboratory medicine and pathology. Hi, Bill. Welcome back.
Yeah, we're here for another week of conversation, and still with COVID. Because we're still working our way through this latest surge.
Yeah, and here we are in the first month of 2022. I thought this would be a good time to reflect on the state of COVID in the world. Today, we talk a lot about what's happening locally in the United States, because of course that's where you and I are based, but we do have listeners from around the world, and COVID and how it's impacted people living in different parts of the world is very different than how it's impacted people living in the United States. And I know you attended a global summit that I think would be very interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I and it's certainly, as we look into the year, it's gotten off to the start we wanted to in this country, or with Omicron. But how do we start to look beyond our borders and thinking about how this is going to play out? How is it playing out right now, and what is it going to mean for all of us here in 2022? As you mentioned, there was the global summit, which is actually mid-September now, so it's already about 4 months or so in the rear view.
Sure.
But there was a lot of discussion at that time. I think that was organized by the Biden administration to be coincident with the UN Global Summit. I think at that time part of that was because that's when there was a push for boosting in the United States and getting booster vaccines available. Of course, there's been more of an impetus on that as we've seen recently, just because of the potential for booster to help protect against Omicron, right? And the Omicron surge. But at the same time, at that global summit, there was a lot of concern expressed by other countries across the globe where the vaccination rate was much lower, where the access to treatments, access even to oxygen and some of the basic treatments was much more difficult. And then, of course, last week, I think it was, we saw from the WHO a position of really suggesting not to boost, adolescents and children, that they didn't see benefit. And I think that, again, caused some confusion, but it really is people thinking about how we distribute all these tools globally versus how we distribute them locally, just because different parts of the world, as you said, are experiencing different things.
Yeah, this has been a big topic amongst the global health community, which I am a part of because of my work in tropical medicine, global health, and parasitology. And there's been a lot of discussion about these inequities and how we could actually distribute vaccines in an equitable fashion with what we have today across the world, by targeting people that are really at need, elderly, people with disabilities, immunocompromising conditions, and healthcare workers. But it would mean that then perhaps we wouldn't be boosting some of the younger people where maybe they have a higher immunity or don't necessarily need that additional dose. Of course, we have to go with the science, and the science in our country tells us that the boosters are highly beneficial. So it's really two different ways of looking at the problem of vaccination. If you're a resource-rich country and you can follow the science, you want to boost your entire population. But how do you expand that to the whole world?
Yeah, it was. I think that, like a lot of things in healthcare, the pandemic has really brought to public awareness, or a broader awareness, a lot of the issues that we existed prior to the pandemic. And then certainly just around global health and how we even just distribute the tools to keep people hopefully safe from illness, or treat them for illness in a more seamless and equitable way, as to your point. And I think that these are things that we're just going to have to figure out. There's two things I would say. Number one is data. There's a lot of there's just parts of the world we don't have as good a data, so we don't know where those tools are most needed. To your point, even how do we identify people at risk in different countries, where the healthcare, just the data around people's health is not as rich as it might be in some other countries. And then what is the whole infrastructure? I mean, we keep hearing about supply chain. Anyone's hearing about supply chain now. People probably talk more about supply chain than they ever have in their whole lives, just about everything, right?
Yeah.
But then this whole thought of supply chain around health globally is a real issue, because you have, different levels of delivery systems. So if you put the tools in place, how effective can they be delivered? And then likewise, what are some of the rules just around manufacturing, around raw materials going across borders? Just some very things we would never think about in healthcare, but that really are driving a lot of our ability to respond to some of these, to a challenge like this on a global scale. And it's gonna really, I think, spur a lot of thought and debate coming out of this when we eventually do. But the reality is there's still a real problem and a need for it right now.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be at a better place because of the work everyone's doing now. And on a positive note, there has been the creation of this organization called COVAX. It's an international partnership with the World Health Organization. And this organization has basically licensed vaccines for emergency use authorization around the world. And they put a lot of thought into all those things you just talked about, Bill, like supply chain. How do we get vaccines to people in really remote populations where there's not a road half of the year because it's washed out in the rainy season? So there are now 9 COVID vaccines listed under emergency use authorization by the World Health Organization. And despite the challenges of still getting them to people, the 9 vaccines are very helpful because they're produced across many parts of the world. Some are produced in India, some are produced in China and Russia. And some of them don't have those really strict storage conditions that some of the vaccines we're using in the United States do, with the requirement for a cold chain. So that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and as you're speaking, I think one of the things, and particularly, the focus of our discussions on these podcasts is really thinking about, so the way all this works, as I have had, had the opportunity to participate in Accelerator for COVID Tools work, which was divided into 3 work streams. It was organized by the WHO and the Global Fund, a lot of global health participants. One, of course, was vaccines, one was treatment, one was diagnostics. Mm-hmm. And the way that this works is they really go, these entities go and appeal to countries to say, look, we need to make investments in this so we can have a global infrastructure to address these challenges on these 3 different areas. The hardest one was diagnostics. Yeah. So to your point, again, a lot of thought and it's easier to go raise people's awareness around vaccines, but the reality, without good diagnostic tools, we don't know how to even deploy some of those life-saving technologies, even oxygen. And so that's, again, an opportunity. And that's because it's really for the laboratories to really step forward and say, look, without a good diagnostics infrastructure, we really don't have eyes on these different parts of the world where we really know help is needed. And so how do we start to build that out? I think that in the US, for instance, there's a lot of movement towards, and you and I have talked about it, this kind of remote collection. You don't have to go to a doctor. In the US, that might be a lot around convenience. In other parts of the world, it might be a lot about, we need to build this because it's really the only way that people will have access to the diagnostics. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that benefits all of us, because as we've learned, this is going to be, and Omicron has reminded us, this is a global health issue. And I think it will continue to be for at least the next couple of years. So it's just, again, as we start to think about what's needed from our profession, is to really think about the value that we contribute, and that we need to be participating in lots of different conversations, because now is the time that people are asking, what do we need to put in place to get us through this? And then how durable does it need to be going into the future, so that it's sustainable?
Yeah, one of the comments that COVAX has made on their website, one of their statements is, no one is safe until everyone is safe. They have learned a lot, and overcoming supply chain barriers, logistics, those are all things that we've learned a lot about since the pandemic began. And I guess I would put a little positive note in there that we have made great strides with strides with other infectious diseases. We've eliminated or actually eradicated smallpox from the face of the earth. And we have now got polio down to elimination across all the countries except for 2, which would be Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we can come together as a global society when we need to. Some things are a little bit more challenging, and unfortunately the vaccines for SARS-CoV-2 don't provide complete sterilizing immunity, although they're quite protective. So there's some differences in comparing this to, say, smallpox and polio. But regardless, I think we have learned that we can come together to give these protective life-saving vaccines when possible. So it's going to be an onward challenge, but I think that we've learned a lot along the way.
I agree, and I think I would make a slight modification for our perspective, from the laboratory perspective, is that a person can only get the treatment they need if they know the disease or the diagnosis that they have, right? And so this need for kind of testing infrastructure that reaches all kind of pockets of society, both within the U.S. and across the world, is a need. It's really, if we're going to talk about equitable distribution of healthcare, I mean, that has to be a part of the conversation. In fact, I would argue, it's part of where we start, right? Because to your point, there's some disease that hopefully we can eradicate for all people, for our collective benefit. So it's, again, this whole idea of thinking about, to leave it, to come back to your point, the only way we'll get there with diagnostics, again, is with teamwork. I mean, it has to be the laboratorians representing the needs of the patients and the populations that we serve, working with the diagnostic companies so they can think about how to get into these, which they are now more than ever, thinking about how they get into some of these different areas of the world and in our own country, what kind of tools are there. And then last but not least, working with public health officials and others to say, how do we systematize it, right? If we have this deployed, how do we get that data so we can know what's happening and where we need to really focus some of our efforts in terms of disease prevention and cure. But diagnostics has always been sort of the last one that people think about, although it's really the most important in terms of informing all those choices.
Yeah, essential. If you don't know who's infected and why and what the distribution of disease is, you really can't even make those public health decisions. Excellent points, Bill. Well, as always, it's been great talking to you about all of this, and I'm sure we'll be revisiting this subject in the coming months, because we're going to be continuing in this pandemic for a while.
Yeah, I think so. And there's going to be a lot of conversation afterwards. So again, the recurring theme is, this is something of great societal interest, not just within our country, but across the globe, in terms of the equities and the disparities that we're seeing across the world that have been really illustrated by COVID. Don't be timid about stressing the importance of diagnostics and the need to build that diagnostics infrastructure, because really there's not many people who are aware of it, and it's really our job is to elevate to people's attention. So it's another good cause that we can all kind of put our shoulders to the wheel on. Totally
agree. Great points, Bill. Thank you again.
Yeah, it's great talking with you as always. I'm sure we'll have something to talk about next week.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Answers from the Lab. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast, and don't forget to tune in every Thursday and every other Tuesday.